So today in the morning, we're going to talk about tips and tricks for invisible class 4 restorations. And I want to get started announcing our Restorative Academy series. As you know, and we've been announcing this for some time now, we will start our first session is going to be November of this year, November 2020. This is a CE course that is going to extend throughout 6 months all the way down to April of 2021. And our first online seminar will be series will be on dental photography. So if you need or just want more information about this Restorative Academy series starting November of this year, please visit our webpage, romerodentalseminars.com, or you can email me at romerodentalseminars@gmail.com, and I will be more than happy to share with you more information on this. And again, just think about it, analyze. You're going to get 58 CE credits on this course, and it's really going to help you just increase the quantity of larger cases in your practice, and that's the ultimate goal. You know how to go about treating large restorative cases in your practice. We want to thank our sponsors, Colteen, Oral Arts Dental Laboratories, Comet, and BNR for their support of this webinar series throughout the entire year. And as a thank you to them, we want to make sure that we acknowledge them, and we want to make sure that you understand that you can receive one free CE credit provided by the generous support of these companies. So at the end of the presentation, you will be able to access our quiz that is already uploaded in our webpage. This is our webpage, and as I always share with you, you can visit us at romerodentalseminars.com. Once you click the webinars link, you will find 3 links underneath that webinar link. The first one is for our live webinars. You can visit that site and you will find out what future topics we have. We're getting ready for you. The topics will go out through December of this year. The second link is the on-demand channel, where you can find our previous webinars that were recorded and uploaded to this site. And you can view them. And of course, you can always go then to our CE quizzes link, and you will find the quizzes associated with our webinar. So you can still go back and review any of the webinars, and then just submit the quiz to our email address, romerodentalseminars@gmail.com. And we will be more than happy to give you one CE credit for that, for any of the webinars that you complete. The objectives for today's webinar, our first objective is going to be help you understand the different restorative options that we have for class 4 restorations. Learn how to effectively use the infinite bevel technique, which is, I believe, that one of the most important aspects of large class 4s when you want to make them really invisible. And learn how to restore small to large class 4 lesions using single or multiple shade opacities. And we're going to try to share with you a couple of cases so that you can kind of figure out, when is it that you want to use a single shade, or when do you want to layer and try to recreate nature using multiple opacities. So let's get started with our tip and trick number 1 for the day. So the first tip and trick I want to share with you is in relationship with the different techniques that we have available to restore class 4s. Many of us are in that the realm of just using a single shade. We have that as an option, and we can definitely use a single shade of composite to restore some of the medium class 4s that show up in our practice. I do want you to understand that if you do want to use a single shade, you have to understand that today's composites, many of the composites today, come in or have their shades in multiple opacities. So if you were to choose a single shade for a class 4 restoration, I most likely recommend to use more of a dentin shade for you to be able to achieve a good transition between the tooth and the restoration, and not end up with a gray restoration. This is crucial. And again, we have a webinar where we discuss shade selection, and I would highly recommend for you to review that webinar again, so that you can kind of go through the process of how do I select either a single shade or multiple opacities for a large class 4 or for composite veneers. But definitely using a single shade is an option, and it has a lot to do with the chromacity or the color gradient that is presented on the tooth that you're going to be able to restore. Another technique would be to combine enamel and dentin, to use two different opacities. And if you decide to do something like this, then you will have to layer your restoration. And normally we would recommend for you to do a lingual layer, to have made out, a lingual layer with enamel shade. And then you will have a second layer. And I would recommend for you to use a dentin layer as your second layer right on top of that lingual enamel layer. And then finally, you will have a facial enamel layer, which is going to be your final layer. So this is more of a sandwich technique, if you want to call it that way, where you have translucent uh, composite or enamel shade composite on the lingual and on the facial. And right in the center or in the middle aspect, you will have your dentin shade that is going to help you get the opacity that you really need. Now, a final technique that you can use, or a third technique that you can use to restore class 4 type of restorations, is a multi-layer technique, where now you are using a combination of different shades, opacities, and tints in order for you to recreate nature. So all these are valid techniques. Again, this is really dependent on the clinical situation that the patient will present to your practice. And I'll share with you a couple of cases today where I used a single shade, or where I'm using a more of a layer technique with some tints and opacers in order for me to achieve a better outcome. But this is how you would do that. You would start out with a lingual enamel layer. Then you will place a second layer with a dentin. And as you can see, this dentin is a little bit shy of the incisal edge. Then, right at the incisal edge, I will add a very thin layer of a tint, a very white, opaque tint. And you would do this if you need to recreate a halo on one of these restorations at the incisal edge. And this is normally the case for younger patients that do have this halo, this white opaque line right at the incisal edge. So if you want to recreate that, you're going to need to use a very white opaque resin in order for you to be able to recreate that. Now, right on top of that white opaque resin, if you need to recreate the halo, you not only need the white resin, but you're going to need a little bit of a gray resin or a translucent resin in order for you to mimic the translucency effect between the mamelons right at that incisal third. And again, this is a more complex technique, but there will be cases where you're going to need to be very thorough at the selection of the multiple shades that you're going to be using. And once you have that gray shade in that incisal third, your final layer is going to be the enamel. So right here we have three different techniques. Either you're using a single shade, you're using a more of a sandwich technique where you use two opacities, enamel and dentin, or you do a multi-layer technique where you're using enamel dentin, gray translucent, and white opaque in order for you to be able to recreate the characteristics of that incisal third, the highly aesthetic characteristic of incisal third, most likely in young patients. But there's one aspect of this technique that is also crucial. You know, once you're done selecting the type of technique that you know you're going to be using for this patient, and for me, the most important aspect is the design of the bevel. How do I design a bevel so that I can make this really work for my patients and make it really invisible, that transition between the tooth structure and my composite resin. And here is uh, a good example. Normally, when you fabricate a bevel, as you can see, we've prepped this tooth. There's a fracture in the incisal third on both of these teeth, and now I have a very long aesthetic bevel. And as we all know, you have two different type of bevels in restorative dentistry. You have a very short functional bevel, which is normally half of a millimeter thick, and then you have a longer bevel that is used more in aesthetic cases. And obviously, this is going to be more of a bevel that you use on the facial aspect of teeth, which is called the aesthetic bevel. An aesthetic bevel is a bevel that, the length of the bevel is normally between 2 to 3 millimeters, is kind of like a 40 to 45-degree bevel on the facial aspect of teeth. And you can see it here. I have completed my aesthetic bevel. It is approximately 2 millimeters on both of these teeth that have a class 4 type of lesion or fracture. But there's one more thing that is important for this bevel in order for you to make this bevel disappear. Because if you think about it, once you fabricate this bevel using a diamond burr at that 40 to 45-degree angle, you're going to end up with a sharp line right at this middle third of the tooth, at this more apical aspect of your bevel, and on the incisal aspect of the bevel. You're going to end up with these two sharp angles here. And what I want you to do is, once you fabricate your aesthetic bevel, I want you to go about polishing that bevel and making this transition line nice and round. So instead of leaving this sharp angle at the most apical aspect or cervical aspect of your bevel, go ahead and polish that bevel using a disc. Polish the bevel on the enamel and make everything nice, smooth, and round. And I'm going to tell you and I'm going to show you how this is going to help. So the first thing that I want you to see is, when you have a fractured tooth, you normally are going to have these sharp line angles everywhere, all, surrounding or around your entire fracture, or the entire fracture. So what we need to do here is that we need to identify which type of bevel am I going to use to restore this tooth. And normally, you're going to go ahead and you're going to fabricate what we call an aesthetic bevel. Some dentists like to do this very small bevel, which is called a functional bevel. This is not an aesthetic bevel. So this very short bevel is not recommended for aesthetic cases. And if you think about it, that transition between the composite and the tooth is so small, so short, because this is only half of a millimeter thick, that this transition line is always going to be visible. So what you need to do is that you need to create what is called an aesthetic bevel, which is a thicker bevel. It's a bevel that, instead of being half of a millimeter, is going to be more of a 1.5 to 2 millimeter bevel. Now look at the difference between this bevel and the bevel that I am recommending for you to do. This functional bevel would be okay for you to do in the lingual aspect of this class 4. But on the facial aspect of your class 4, you want to make sure that you get a nice and wide bevel. Now, when you get this wide aesthetic bevel, make sure that this bevel goes all around to the inner proximal area. So you want to continue the thickness of the same thickness of this bevel all the way down to the inner proximal area, so that you get a nice and round transition in this area as well. But there's one more thing, as I told you before, that you need to do. You need to make sure that you understand that this long bevel will still end up in a sharp line, straight, sharp line at towards the end of the bevel. So what I would recommend for you to do here is to do this tip and trick number 2. So now you know you have your aesthetic bevel, which is a 1.5 to 2 millimeter thick bevel that surrounds the entire fracture on the facial and inner proximal area. On the lingual aspect, you're okay with keeping your half of a millimeter or 1 millimeter bevel. But the second tip is that now I want you to come in with your disc, with a coarse disc, because you are polishing enamel, and I want you to polish the bevel. So I want you to polish the entire surface so that you make this sharp line disappear completely. So we're going to grab this white bevel and we're going to polish the bevel. And I always recommend, we do have a webinar on finishing and polishing, but of the restoration. But when you're beveling, when you're polishing your bevel to create what we call an infinite bevel, I would still recommend using a little bit of water. It just leaves a nice and smooth area. But as you can see, I'm getting the disc, I'm placing this disc in the inner proximal area as well, so that I can make sure that everything is nice and round. I don't want to leave any sharp angles anywhere. And what this is going to allow you is going to help you make that transition line between the two structure and your composite resin be invisible. And this is important because that's the area, that's the critical area that you want to make sure that you achieve. Now, what you're seeing here in this photo is, on the left-hand side, you're seeing my aesthetic bevel, with my 80, that was done with my 8888 burr. And now you can see that I have drawn here with a pencil the sharp area of that finish line. On the right-hand side, this is after I have completed polishing of the bevel. Once my bevel is polished, you can barely tell that there's a bevel here. you don't see that sharp line anymore. I want you to see the inner proximal area, how nice and round that area is as well. And most importantly, you can barely tell that there's any strokes left behind by your diamond burr. So the surface needs to be nice and polished, nice and round, so that the transition between your composite and the tooth structure, and I'll show you clinical cases, is completely invisible. And just to show you here an example, this is a plastic tooth where I have, created the infinite bevel by polishing my aesthetic bevel, and this is my completed restoration. This is the same tooth. Now this is my completed composite restoration, where you can see that is impossible, literally invisible, the transition line between my composite and the remainder of this plastic tooth. And the reason why this transition line is invisible is because of that infinite bevel. That thick infinite bevel makes this line, this transition between the composite and the tooth interface, disappear completely. So my tip and trick number 3 at this point will be showing you or sharing with you some cases where I'm going to start with very small restorations, and I'm going to take you to larger restorations so that you can see how using the same principles and the same concepts, regardless of the layering technique, either a single shade or multiple opacities, you will see that the transition line between the composite and the tooth is going to disappear. Now it does make a big difference when the shade selection is correct. So that's, again, I'm recommending you to go back and view our shade selection webinar. But for now, what I want to get into and what I want to try to convey to you is the importance of that infinite bevel in restorative dentistry, the importance of the infinite bevel in the class 4 restoration lesion. So we're going to start with this very small incisal edge fracture on this on number 9, on this left central incisor, tooth number 9. And what I'm going to do here first is I'm going to go ahead and select my basic shade. I am going to layer this because, as you can see on tooth number 8, patient has a lot of white spots, has a little bit of white halo, has some gray areas as well. So I'm going to make sure that I layer this so that I can try to mimic as much as I can that the intrinsic characteristics of tooth number 8 on my restoration on tooth number 9. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to select my basic shade. And in this particular case, my basic shade is going to be an enamel shade because, as you can see, there's only enamel missing in that little fracture. So I have chosen an enamel shade, and I've made sure that this enamel shade that I have chosen after I lacquer blends in well with the surrounding tooth structure. So you can see that the shade that I selected blends in with the surrounding tooth structure. Once I do that, and once I'm happy with the shade that I have selected, I'm going to go in and I'm going to create my aesthetic bevel. And again, remember, my aesthetic bevel should be 1.5 to 2 millimeters in width. And you can see here, I'm using my 8888 diamond burr. I'm going to go in and create, just bevel this area with a 40 to 45 degree angle of the burr. And this is now my aesthetic bevel. You can see that I've created a bevel approximately 2 millimeters in width, considering from the incisal edge towards the middle portion of the tooth. And now my next step is polish that aesthetic bevel. So using a coarse disc, I'm going to go in using a little bit of water, and I'm going to polish that bevel. And as you can see here on the photo on the right hand side, now you cannot see the strokes left behind by my diamond burr. You cannot see the sharp line that I had initially in between my bevel and the actual middle portion of the tooth. And you can tell that I have polished this area and it appears to be nice and smooth. I've actually extended my bevel a little more beyond the area where I use my burr. And I'm actually at this point on very close to the middle third of the tooth. This is very important because I want to etch all this area, and I want to make sure that I extend my enamel layer towards that middle third so that I can benefit from that extra enamel to bond to. This will keep my restoration in place, is increasing my bonding surface to improve the bonding capabilities of my resin to the actual tooth structure. So once you polish the bevel, we're going to go ahead and acid etch. And now, because that bevel has been, I'm sorry, the tooth structure has been beveled, I only need to acid etch for 15 seconds. And again, please don't forget that I'm going to extend my etchant beyond the area that I have beveled. That's why I went ahead and I polished beyond my bevel. So I have now an infinite bevel. I don't see where my transition line is anymore. I'm going to over etch that area, and I'm going to etch for 15 to 20 seconds my enamel. Once I have achieved a good and ideal etching time, I'm going to go ahead and rinse, and I'm going to apply my primer and my adhesive. Once I do that, I'm going to light cure my adhesive layer, and I'm going to start layering my composite. And as I showed you on the different techniques that I have on the previous slide, we're going to start this particular case that I'm going to layer enamel and some opacers and some grays. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start from the lingual. So the first layer that I'm adding is a little bit of enamel shade on the lingual aspect of that very small fracture that I had on that the patient had or presented with on tooth number 9. Once I do that, my second layer is going to be that white opaque shade of composite that, as you can see here, I have added a little bit to the restoration, and using a very thin endo file, like a number 10 or a number 8 endo file, I'm going to just create some irregularities just to mimic what the patient had on the incisal third of tooth number 9. So that's what you're seeing that I'm doing right here. I'm going to head and I'm going to go ahead and light cure that opaque layer, and then I'm going to add my final enamel layer. And as you can see, that final enamel layer extends throughout my entire infinite bevel. So I've gone beyond the fracture area. The fracture area was only located on the incisal third, but I'm taking advantage of all this enamel to assure myself and secure my restoration with a good and long bonded surface. And once you do that, you polish the area. This photo was taken immediately after removal of the rubber dam. You can see a little bit of gingival inflammation here, but you can see as well that the transition between my composite and the tooth structure is almost invisible. There's a little bit of the line that you can still see around this area right here where I'm actually using the arrow. And this is directly related to that dehydration of tooth number 9 because of the rubber dam. But when you look at this photo on a very, very nice close up, you can see that the line is right here. I'm following the line with the cursor right here. You can see a little bit of the composite and the tooth transition. But what we're going to do is that we're going to polish this restoration, highly polish the restoration, and we're going to give this patient a couple of weeks. We'll bring him back, and you will see that that line that is barely perceptible the day of is going to be completely imperceptible a couple of days or a couple of weeks later once the tooth rehydrates completely. So from that very small restoration, we're going to go to our tip and trick number 4, and we're going to use a different technique but following the same principles for a larger class 4 restoration. So I'm going to share with you this other case where you can see that we have two very rough, very, very badly polished, I would say, composites on tooth number 8 and number 9. Patient was very unhappy with the aesthetics of these two previous restorations. So we were going to go ahead and remove these restorations, and we were going to go and fabricate or restore these two teeth with two new composite restorations using a single shade. So I'm going to go ahead and use a single shade. I'm selecting right here my basic shade. I chose to use A2, and I'm going to go ahead and use a composite, a dentin shade composite with a single, using a single shade, and I'm gonna go ahead and restore this tooth using the same principles. So regardless of the number or the type of composite that I'm going to use, or the technique for my layer, the layering technique that I'm going to be using for a patient, my principles are not going to change. I'm still going to use the infinite bevel to make that transition line disappear. So here I'm going to use a single shade, but regardless of that single shade that I'm going to choose, I'm still going to use the same principles regarding my infinite bevel to make that transition line disappear. So you can see now I have polished the bevel. You can see how nicely polished the bevel is. You cannot tell that there was a burr that was placed on this tooth to create a 40 to 45 degree bevel, because I have polished the bevel. And look at how thick the bevel is. So it's very thick on that middle portion, maybe 3 or 4 millimeters here, and it's a little bit less, maybe 2 millimeters here, because of the location of the fracture and the size of the fracture. I wanted to make sure that I was gonna bond to as much enamel as I could. So right here, I'm placing my lingual layer. Again, I'm just using a single shade, but I decided to use the same layering technique here. I'm going to add more in the middle portion inside the third, and then I'm going to do my final layer, and then I'm going to do what I call a pre-polishing of my composite. So I'm going to identify the line angles. I'm going to go ahead and get the right length, get the right shape for my line angles, and just do my pre-polishing. I'm not done with polishing here, but at this point, even though I have cotton rolls and I have a cheek retractor here, you can see that that transition line between the composite, this is all composite, and this is the tooth structure up here. Even though I'm using a single shade and there is no enamel, there is no dentin, there is halo, there is no gray, it's just a single shade of dentin composite, dentin shade composite. You can see that the transition, it's almost invisible, even though the tooth structure is a little bit dehydrated. So once I'm done with tooth number one, or in this case tooth number eight, I still have to complete my polishing, but I'm done with my layering and my pre-polishing procedures. I'm going to go ahead and remove the composite on tooth number nine. Here you go. I've removed the composite on tooth number nine. Look at the extent of my infinite bevel, a very long bevel. I want to make sure that I get really good bonding to all these enamel so that I can keep my restoration in place and have a successful restoration for a long period of time. So that's what I've done here. Infinite bevel again, polish the bevel and start restoring that tooth using exactly the same technique and obviously exactly the same shade and same composite. I have completed the layering steps here, and now I'm going to go ahead and polish my restorations again, do my pre-finishing polishing on tooth number nine, and then go back and complete my polishing on tooth number eight and nine. This photo was taken 7 days later. So this is 1 week post-op, single shade. I want you to see here, this is the patient's tooth structure here, and right here is my composite, right here is my composite. Look at the way that I was able to blend a single shade of composite to the actual patient's enamel on this gingival aspect. So again, the beauty of this technique is that the transition between the composite and the tooth structure becomes invisible because of this very slow transition from thick to thin composite all the way up in the gingival third. And these are two very large class fours. So again, I use the same technique regardless of the size of, of the fracture or the size of the restoration. And now I'm going to share with you a final case in my tip and trick number 5, which is a case done by one of my students a couple of years ago. But I wanted to share with you this case because look at the size of this fracture. So this patient had very little tooth structure left on tooth number 10. You can see there was a big fracture. The tooth was vital. There was no periapical lesion. So, and you can see that there was a lot of staining on his natural teeth. So what we decided to do here first, we decided to bleach his teeth first. So the student went ahead, bleached the teeth, and took the patient shade from C4 to C2. So we had some improvement in the shade of the final shade. So that now we were going to be able to improve a little bit and select a little bit of a lighter shade for our restoration. And again, here we're going to follow a layering technique. And one of the things that I recommend for these large class 4 restorations, if you are not used to doing these, if you're not doing these a lot in your practice and you're just getting started for the larger ones, I would highly recommend that you do a wax up and fabricate a lingual matrix. Again, this is one of my student cases. So this was actually the first large class 4 that this student was executing in the clinical floor at the dental school. So what we wanted to make sure is that for her to achieve a really good result, we asked her to wax up the tooth to ideal contours on a solid cast, and then we went ahead and obtained an impression of that wax up, and that's what you're seeing here. This matrix that she fabricated on the cast out of the wax up. So what this will allow you is a couple of things. Number one, it would allow you to achieve a very nice anatomical lingual layer. So you have an ideal shaped lingual layer that is going to mimic the final contours, at least on the lingual side, the final contours and the final length of your restored tooth. That's the number one reason why I like using this technique. Number two, it would allow you better control of the thickness of that first layer. In this particular case, we're going to combine enamel, dentin, and intensifiers. So we want to make sure that these enamel layers are calibrated. In our enamel layer, we don't want this enamel layer to be on the lingual aspect, greater than 1 millimeter, and on the facial aspect, thicker or greater than half of a millimeter. So with this lingual matrix, we're going to be able to control the thickness of the lingual layer for it not to be more than 1 millimeter, between zero point 0.5 and 1 millimeter. So again, there is a good rubber dam isolation. Look at the infinite bevel, very little tooth structure left behind, but we were able to create a very nice bevel on the facial and interproximal and lingual. And we asked her to polish the entire surface of the bevel, just like I've shown you before. Then we're going to go ahead and apply the first layer onto the lingual matrix, and then we'll sit the lingual matrix into the patient's mouth. Once you've acid edge, prime, and bond, obviously the remainder tooth structure. So here you are seeing this lingual layer being applied. This is a half of a millimeter to 1 millimeter thick lingual layer. Patient has seated the guide, the matrix guide, and now is making sure that this layer blends in and attaches to the remainder aspect of the tooth structure. Only the lingual aspect of this little tooth structure left behind. Once you sit that and you make sure that these both blend well, you go ahead and you light cure that first layer, and then you start working on top of this layer, adding, in this particular case, we added a little bit of an opaque layer because this lingual enamel shell was very translucent. We wanted to make sure that we would not end up with a gray restoration. So we had the student add a little layer of an opaque so that we can eliminate that excessive amount of translucency of this enamel layer on the lingual aspect. Now you can see that she's been able to build up some of that tooth structure. I would say 80% of the tooth structure using a dentin shade. Right on top of that dentin shade, she added a little bit more of the white just to recreate some of the white spots that the patient had on the facial aspect of his natural teeth, and then a final enamel layer. As you have been able to see, we've only used the lingual shell or the lingual matrix, to recreate the lingual shell. But look how nicely that first lingual layer has helped the student maintain the anatomy and the correct shape of the tooth in every layer. So this is why I highly recommend, if you don't do a lot of these cases, or if you're just getting started in your practice, please go ahead and always, make an impression, wax to the ideal anatomy, and then go ahead and fabricate a lingual matrix. Now, we don't have this topic yet in our webinars, but we are going to create a webinar on digital wax ups so that we can share with you, I would say, an easier way of doing some of your wax ups with using digital means instead of using a stone cast and just regular wax. Obviously, for you to be able to do this, you're going to have to scan the patient's mouth. You're going to have a scanner in your practice, but we are going to create a webinar for this, and it'll be announced soon. So hopefully you can join us there as well, and we will go ahead and teach you how to develop a digital wax up so that you can then print one of your models, print your completed wax up, and then fabricate your lingual matrix out of that printed model. So here you go. She's added her final enamel layer, and she's now ready to remove the rubber dam, finish and polish that restoration. This photo was obtained by our student immediately after this case was completed. So you can see a little bit of the blood in this area because we went ahead and removed all the excess, make sure that all the margins were nice and smooth, and just to help her achieve ideal contours and a polished surface. But I want to show you the follow-ups that we have of this case. This is a 15-day follow-up. Now you can see how good of a blend this composite layering technique was to the remainders tooth structure up in the gingival aspect. And this is 15 days post-operatively. But let me check you a little bit longer. This is 6 months later. So 6 months later, restoration is still in good shape. Look at how the restoration now blends in even better for the patient was a smoker, so now you get a little bit of nicotine around it, and you just continue to blend in well. Look at the nice smooth surface, and this is 1 year later. The restoration is still in place. Again, think about, remember the very small abutment that we had, the very small tooth structure that was left, and the huge size of this class 4. So think about that, because there is no post, there is no root canal, there are no pins. This is just relying 100% on a really good bonded restoration, and we took advantage of whatever enamel was left, and that's what we incorporated using our infinite bevel technique. And again, now this is 2 years after the restoration has been delivered. And again, I want you to, the restoration is still in place. And you can see how it continues to blend in, but most importantly, it continues to work and function adequately in the patient's mouth. If you think about this, even if we had used just a single shade to restore this tooth, the most important aspect of this presentation today is that these restorations work and work well when you have even a little bit of enamel, but you take advantage of all the enamel that you have in order for you to blend and bond in these restorations using the infinite bevel concepts and techniques. So this is my last slide.